guys, welcome back to the channel. I hope you're having a great day so far. I'm really excited about today's video. For those of you who are new, my name is Daniel Townsend. I am a local music instructor, and the reason I'm so excited for today's video is it's kind of getting back down to fundamentals. Today's topic is actually going to kickstart a sort of video series I plan to be doing, and today's episode is about answering a very important question. That is, what is a scale? That is, how do we define a scale? What's a scale made of? So that's what I'm going to try to explain to you guys today through a bunch of different visuals and examples. So in a more formal sense, welcome to the How to Play a Scale series, where we're going to break down the ins and outs of different scales through a theoretical and practical approach. So let's begin to try to answer the question, what is a scale? So a scale, very simply put, is basically just a collection of different notes. So imagine that you had like a swimming pool in your backyard and you took out some letters of the alphabet out of a bag and kind of just picked some at random and threw them into a pool. And within that pool, you're given a bunch of different notes. So that's kind of what a scale is like. It's like a collection of different notes. Now, it's a very basic way of thinking about what a scale is, but to go deeper into this, a scale can also be described as a series of intervals. And intervals are something we're going to cover a ton in this video lesson. So you might be asking, what's an interval? An interval is simply just the distance between two different notes. It doesn't matter if they're really close or far apart. There's a way to define just about how far apart those two notes are. So when I say that a scale is defined by the series of intervals in it, what I'm really saying is that the scale is sort of defined by the different spaces in between each note. Those spaces give a scale sort of its character and its sound. So there's a bunch of different scales out there, and some scales have more notes than others. But typical Western scales generally have 7 notes or sometimes 5 notes. But I thought today we would start with the scale that has the most notes. This is called the chromatic scale. Okay, so the chromatic scale. So to get into this, it's important to understand that all Western music is based off of 12 different pitches. So that is to say that when you write a song, you really just have 12 different pitches that can be used in any combination or any order to create your song. So with that said, the chromatic scale is simply just all 12 of those notes put together. That's why it has the most notes out of any scale. And you can't possibly get more than 12 notes because that's all we got. So the chromatic scale is pretty simple to grasp, but it's a good gateway into scales. So I'm going to demonstrate the chromatic scale. If you have a guitar handy, go ahead and grab it. I'm going to demonstrate this on the piano afterward, but I'm going to demonstrate the chromatic scale on one guitar string. I'm going to use the high E string, or the first string of your guitar. Okay? So the chromatic scale uses all 12 pitches. Check this out. Our first note is going to be the open E string here. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Once we reach the 13th note, that note ends up being the same pitch as the one we started on. So we get 12 different pitches, and then the whole thing simply just loops on itself and plays those same 12 pitches again, but they sound higher up. So on and so forth. So thinking about it this way, another way we can describe what a scale is that a scale is basically a series of intervals that repeats at the octave. The octave being the same note that you started on. So for example, for us, the octave of this E note is up here. So we get a series of intervals. In this case, all these notes are right next to each other, but we get a series of intervals that repeats at the octave. So that same series of intervals repeats once again. Now, one last thing I want to talk about with the chromatic scale is the concept of a half step. So a half step is essentially the shortest amount of distance that you can get between two notes. So for example, if I choose a note at random, how about the 5th fret here on the high E string? If I were to move a half step upward in pitch, I would end up right here. Now you see on guitar, there's no notes in between that. So a half step is essentially the closest distance that you can get between two notes. So if we look at the chromatic scale is made up of a bunch of half steps, all in a row. You know, from the first note that's open to the 1st fret note here, that's a half step. from the first fret to the second fret is also a half step, so on and so forth until you reach the top. Alright, so here we are at the piano. Now I like to use the piano to demonstrate and explain different music theory concepts. And I guess the big reason for this is because the piano is just laid out in such a nice, intuitive way. It's really easy to understand the relationships in music and kind of what's happening. So whether or not you've had experience playing a piano before or you've never even touched this instrument before, it's a really useful tool to understand music theory. So let's talk about where C is. So right here is the note C. I know we used E in the guitar demonstration, but we're going to use C. And you can find that right to the left of these two black keys here. Okay, so now let's talk about how to find a half step on the piano. In order to move a half step up in pitch, we're going to move to the next available note. It doesn't matter if it's black or white. So right here would be our first half step. And if you continue to move up in half steps, so you can see kind of the direction that you would go, eventually you would reach C right up here, and that's an entire octave. So, like I said, we have 12 notes in music. And that's sort of a demonstration of all 12 notes moving chromatically by a half step. So let's imagine this particular scale in a different way. Let's say that our beginning note, instead of E like we did on the guitar, let's say our beginning note is the note C. So we're still going to be using a chromatic scale, but we're going to be in the key of C. So a C chromatic scale. All right, so picture that you live in a cul-de-sac and you happen to live in a house that we'll call C. Let's say you have a bunch of neighboring houses in this cul-de-sac, with each one having a different note and name. So we're essentially living in the neighborhood of the C chromatic scale. So let's take a stroll around the neighborhood and check things out. As we walk, let's say clockwise, we notice each house in our C chromatic scale neighborhood is separated by the same distance. Each house is separated by a half step. As we continue to walk, we notice the distance between all of these houses never really changes. It stays the same. So as we count the houses while we walk by, house number, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, we're back home. We're back to our C house. And if we continued to go around in the same circle, we would see the same 12 houses. You can also do this experiment on a clock face. Let's take a look at this clock here. If we start at 12, consider this as our house, and we walk around the clock, you'll notice we get 12 different numbers, that's including our own number, and we end up right back where we started. All right, but what if our neighborhood wasn't as symmetrical as this chromatic scale neighborhood? What if we get tired of living here? Let's say we decided we wanted to move out of this neighborhood, and let's say we wanted to move into the C major cul-de-sac. Well, first, we have to learn about whole steps. So we have to talk about what a whole step is. So a whole step is simply two half steps. Pretty easy to grasp that, right? But let's take the high E string once again. If we move to the second fret right here, do you notice how I moved two half steps? So here's one half step. Here's another half step. And that creates a whole step. So now let's learn the major scale on the high E string on the guitar. And the major scale, along with most scales, has a different combination of half steps and whole steps. Okay, so here we go. We're going to start with our open string, our E note in this case. Next, we're going to go up a whole step, which means we would end up here on the second fret. We're going to move another whole step up to the fourth fret right here. Now we're going to get a half step to the 5, another whole step up to 7, the 7th fret, yet another whole step up to the 9th fret, another whole step up to the 11th fret, and then right here we're going to get a half step that returns us back to where we started on that 12th fret note, which is once again just the note E. Alright, so we're back at the piano again, and we're going to be talking about what the C major scale looks like on piano. Now, it's probably one of the easiest piano scales because it just so happens that it's all the white keys. But let's not think about it this way, let's actually go through all the intervals. So starting on C right here, we get a whole step to the next note. So that's kind of like two half steps. So here's one, and then here's another. So that's a whole step. Great, now we get another whole step. So again, it's like two half steps, 1, 2. Now the next one is actually just going to be a half step, which is the next available note. From here we get another whole step. So here we go, 1, 2. And now we get another whole step, 1, 2. And yet another whole step right here, 1, 2. And now another half step that will actually bring us right back to the note we started on, which is C. Alright, so we finally moved out of that boring old C chromatic scale neighborhood. We moved into our new neighborhood, the C major cul-de-sac. Alright, so now that we're here, let's go ahead and take another stroll around. The first thing we notice is that the next house, the one next to us, is twice as far away as what we had become accustomed to in our previous home. And wait, we see the same distance again between the second house and the third house. It looks like our C house, along with the second house and third house, appear to all be separated by a whole step. Now we're kind of farther apart here. However, as we continue along, house 3 and 4 are closer, but 4 and 5 are further again. And it looks like 5 and 6 are also further, a whole step apart. 6 and 7 are also a whole step apart. Oh wait, and we're back home again. Although this house happens to be one half step away from ours. As you can see, our new neighborhood is no longer symmetrical. It kind of has a different spice. So it's these different whole steps and half steps that give each scale its unique sound and flavor. Now let's learn about different classifications of intervals. As I said previously, we're going to talk about intervals as I think they are probably the most important concept to grasp when it comes to music theory and learning scales. Alright, so say we got evicted from our nice new C major scale home, and we got to go back to the C chromatic scale neighborhood. However, there's been some renovations, and instead of a cul-de-sac, now we're just looking at a straight street here. So all of the houses are kind of lined up in a row now. So we still have the same 12 houses, and this can be represented on a line kind of like this. So for a basic rule of thumb, the closer the house is in relation to us, the shorter the interval. So something like the third house is a lot closer than something like the 10th house way down here. Let's begin by giving each of these houses their interval classification. Alright, so we're looking at the house right next door to us, the house that's closest. Once again, we know that this is just a half step away. It's kind of the closest interval that we get. So this is considered a minor second. Oftentimes you'll see intervals written as either like a minor interval or a major interval. So minor intervals are written with a lowercase m. Major intervals are written with a capital M. And you'll see this as we continue. Okay, so now the third house here has a major second interval. Okay, the next one is a minor third interval. And now the house after that is a major third interval. So far this kind of makes sense, right? You get a minor version and a major version of each of these, right? Now here's something a little tricky. It's a little different. The next house we consider a perfect fourth. And part of the reason for this is it has a nice consonant sound. You know, it is very sturdy, listening to the perfect fourth interval. Moving along, we get, well, this one's a little weird. There's a couple different ways of classifying this interval. We can call it an augmented fourth, meaning a fourth that's sort of stretched out. We can call it a diminished fifth, which is a fifth that has been kind of squashed together a slight bit, so it's not quite as large of an interval. Or we can simply call it the tritone. Now, you're all familiar with this, whether you realize it or not, but the tritone is kind of that devil interval, right? It sounds pretty gross when you play a tritone right there together. So moving along past the tritone, you get a perfect fifth, which is why the diminished fifth is the one that would come before that. Let's continue along. Now we get the minor six, the major six, the minor 7, the major 7, and lastly, we run out of houses. So our houses would essentially repeat again. Let's go ahead and draw our house once again right there. Boom. All right, great. So this would kind of be considered an octave or a perfect eighth, if you want to call it that. So a couple things I want to touch on while we're still here on this street. Most scales that I will touch on in this video series have a perfect fourth and a perfect fifth in them. Not all scales, but most scales tend to have a nice perfect fourth and again perfect fifth in them, right? And then the remaining intervals sort of create the rest of the color of the scale. So in the major scale, what we end up getting, I'll go ahead and circle them as we go along here. We get the roots, we get a major second interval, a major third, our perfect fourth and perfect fifth, a major 6, a major 7, and right back to our root. So interestingly enough, the major scale is made up of all major intervals along with a perfect fourth and a perfect fifth. So, as I said at the beginning of the video, a scale can simply be defined as a series of intervals, and hopefully this helps to understand that concept. Alright guys, so that brings us to the end of the video. I hope you stuck around this long, and hopefully this gave you some tools to understand what a scale is made of, and maybe it will help you to remember certain scales as well. I know this can seem like a lot of information, especially if you have not touched on scales before and you're pretty new to this whole thing, which is exactly why I'm doing a video series breaking down each individual scale in sort of a practical way as well as a theoretical way. This was much more theoretical based, but we're going to have more practical application coming up in the next few videos here. And you may be wondering why I'm talking into a bandana right now. Unfortunately, I lost my pop filter, and while I was listening back to some of these recordings, it hurt to listen to. So I grabbed something that would work as a pop filter, and it is what it is. And I mean, Mudkip fell over it because it's so ridiculous, but here we are. All right, guys, thank you so much for tuning in today. I really appreciate it. Had a lot of fun discussing this topic with you guys. If you haven't liked the video, please go ahead and like the video and turn that little thumb blue for me. It makes me really happy and it helps out the channel a ton. If you haven't subscribed, now is the time because I'm going to have a lot more videos covering all these different topics, including, like today's topic, different scales. Right next to me here, you're going to see some of my previous videos, including some reactions. If you're into those, go ahead and check those out, along with some other educational videos as well. All right, I appreciate you guys. Have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you next time.